What mistakes do you need to avoid this draft season? That is what we are talking about today on the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show. My name is Colm Kelly. I'm joined by Pat Fitzmaurice. We did a show earlier this week where we looked at the running back landscape, kind of big picture, looking at the early rounds and talking some of the rookies, looking at zero RB versus what maybe other strategies you could employ in 2025. But we are going to kick off today's show as we get into mistakes to avoid. This isn't really going to be a mistake to avoid, Pat, but teased at the end of the last show. It is heavily rumored the Steelers are playing in Ireland this year. That is a fact. They're playing in Croke Park Stadium, which is pretty incredible. I never ever imagined that we would get a game in Ireland because we obviously have the NFL in London for quite some time, and it was always a case to me of like, well, it's in London, why would they have a game in Ireland? The people they know will fly over. So they've obviously expanded throughout Europe. They've expanded into Brazil and different countries as they grow the game. But this year, kind of expanded further, and the Steelers got quite involved with some things in Ireland around trying to grow the game. But the Steelers are having a home game in Ireland, which is pretty incredible. But after the NFL draft, the opponent will be named as the schedule is announced, and heavy reports that the Packers are going to be that team. So that will be even more incredible for myself. I did get over a couple of years ago when they played in London. I've got to see them playing in New York. Both games against the Giants, both games they lost. So maybe they get over here and they get to beat the Steelers this year. But yeah, pretty cool for a Packers fan to have an opportunity if they are the case that they do come over and they play here. So Pat, you making the trip over to Ireland to watch the Packers?
Oh man, I would love to, and I know I've got some cousins agitating it from the side of my family that is devoted to the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Okay.
As their primary team. So we have got kind of a civil war within the family. We've got Packers fans and Steelers fans. So it would be quite something for us to make the trip over to Ireland. But it's pretty cool. I mean, the NFL still has its global outlook, obviously, Colm. And, you are walking proof that there are pockets of, devoted NFL support in Ireland. And it would be pretty great to have two franchise. Like, I've always liked the Steelers a lot because they sort of maybe not a mirror image of the Packers as a franchise. Very traditional, very working class, blue collar fan base, very devoted fan base, long track record of success where even in the down years, you're usually contending for a playoff spot, if not in the playoffs. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a fantastic matchup. And how spicy would it be, Colm, if Aaron Rodgers were the Steelers quarterback facing his old team? That would be pretty interesting. And but we'll see if he could play as well as Tommy DeVito did in that London game against the Green Bay Packers, which don't get either of us started on that.
Yeah, pretty wild. I have to go back and check. I think it was Scott Tolzien played in the game that I seen in MetLife Stadium. Rodgers was injured that season as well. So yeah, some hopefully Jordan Love will get the business done this time. But we have to wait for the game to be announced. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But those are the rumored reports. But let's talk about the mistakes to avoid. And to start off, I guess not really a mistake, but what was the biggest lesson, I guess, that you learned in 2024 over the course of the season, and what will it mean for your fantasy outlook for 2025?
I don't know if it was a big lesson, but I think one of the more interesting lessons that came out of last season and came out of the wreckage of the Houston and Chicago passing games. It was so CJ Stroud was coming off that surprisingly big rookie season, and he was going to have this great pass catching trio of Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Stephon Diggs.
Yeah.
And obviously there were some games lost to injury at the wide receiver position for the Texans last year, but the big problem was the offensive line. And Colm, as a fellow Packer fan, I'm sure you can remember that Packers-Texans game last year and how CJ Stroud didn't have any time to throw in that game. And it's not as if Green Bay had some fearsome pass rush. The Houston offensive line was just that bad. And it was kind of the same thing with Chicago. Everyone thought the Bears were setting up Caleb Williams for success as a rookie with the pass catching trio of DJ Moore and Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze, but the Bears offensive line stunk, and it really made things hard for a rookie quarterback. So I guess when we're looking at favorable wide receiver groups that might be able to help elevate quarterbacks, we should probably not be so hyper-focused on the pass catchers and check on those offensive lines before we start predicting big passing numbers. So I don't know how it applies this year. Maybe one team that might fall into that category, the 49ers. I mean, they've got George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk, Juwan Jennings, Ricky Pearsall. Even without Deebo Samuel, that's still a really formidable pass catching group. But that offensive line seems like it's starting to unravel a bit. I mean, Trent Williams is now in his late 30s. They're not airtight at some of the other positions on the O-line. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that was kind of an interesting lesson for me. I think a lot of people fell into that Texans, Bears, wide receiver threesome trap.
Yeah, I don't know, it became very popular on social media, the offensive line talk, when, the Lions get Penei Sewell and, the Bengals drafted Joe Burrow. There was always that question of, like, how is he going to throw it to, not Joe Burrow, sorry, Jamar Chase. How is he going to get the ball to Chase if he's, like, on the ground? There's certain quarterbacks, though, that will be able to do enough to elevate the play. The part there with the 49ers is interesting because they also have, you can't forget about him, but his name is Christian McCaffery, and he's quite good at catching passes out of the backfield. So,
Yes.
there might be ways also to work around that, to try, if you have one side of the offensive line that's holding up a bit better, and how you can decide the scheme and things like that, Kittle over the middle. But I have to say, when we're looking at those two particular examples, what's interesting is it could be a case that they have the receiving weapons and they have the quarterback, that you're kind of confident in both of those parts. So you almost miss out the middle part off the offensive line. Whereas if a team is, not having one of those other two, it's kind of more in your focus that this quarterback's not that good. So he really needs the offensive line to be able to deliver, or they need to have the wide receivers with these certain skill sets to get the ball out quick. I think last year, with both of those teams, there was excitement because we had a rookie quarterback who's picked at the 101. We have a second-year quarterback who had a very good rookie season, as you mentioned. And then you're adding these other pieces to it. So they're adding Keenan Allen and Odunze, and then the Texans are, Dell is meant to be coming back, hopefully healthy at that point last year from his previous injury. And then you're adding Stephon Diggs. But then you get Stephon Diggs banged up, then he's out for the rest of the year. We get the hamstring injury to Nico Collins. The whole thing falls apart pretty quick, and you get the poor quarterback play. So I do think offensive line play is often looked at when maybe you're talking about running backs. There was obviously a lot of talk about the Cowboys offensive line for a long time, or even when the Packers, with Aaron Rodgers, when they, such a strong offensive line that he had so much time to be able to, get the ball out whenever he kind of wanted. But I do agree that it's becoming more and more a focus of what you're trying to do, and also how defenses are setting up to target. We used to see in the past, an edge rusher would stay on the left or the right hand side. Well, now, like, oh, your guy at this side is not very good, I'm going to go over there and, like, get my way through. So defenses they should have changed that a long time ago, but defenses are smartening up to that too.
Yes, totally agree. And about the Texans, Colm, like late last season, I was thinking, I kind of want to be on CJ Stroud in 2025 because I think he was set up for failure. I think he's still really good, and people are going to be down on him after what looked like a step back in year two. But that was assuming the Texans were actually going to make improvements to their offensive line, which hasn't happened thus far in free agency. And not only have they not improved,
trading players away, probably not.
Trading their most reliably effective offensive lineman with Laramie Tunsil going to Washington was a little confounding. So I know they still have the draft to do it, but you also don't want to start 4 rookies on your offensive line. That's a pretty good way to get your quarterback killed.
Yeah, I talked quite a bit last week, kind of on a devil's advocate kind of conversation with Eric when he was on the show. We were talking about CJ Stroud and our perception on him this time last year versus Jaden Daniels and our perception on him right now. And, how they come off the rookie seasons and your expectation for the second year leap and how it all played out. But it's interesting, too, when you mentioned Laramie Tunsil. Now he is with Jaden Daniels. The team is trying to strengthen that offensive line for him. And it was more a devil's advocate of, like, we're this hype now, it could, go back the other way. But I feel like we are at the opposite side when it comes to CJ Stroud. I think realistically, he's probably somewhere in the middle of those 2 years, or maybe even a bit above, the average of those 2 seasons. but I do feel like he's a player that I'll end up drafting quite a bit when we're putting those teams together this year, going as the QB 18 over at the FFPC. So I think he's I think he's probably the QB 10 to 14 range, with some ceiling if he bounces back. But that is it's interesting to look at the offensive line. But when we go then to the overreaction part, is there something from last season that you think people are going to overreact to when they're drafting their teams this year and cause errors that you're trying to avoid?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something we talked about on the earlier show, with the way the injury distribution went last year, which was sort of unusual. I mean, normally the injury rates at running back are higher than they are at wide receiver. And we had such an unusual dynamic last year with running back and wide receiver injuries, with the injury rates sort of being flipped on their head. Other than a few exceptions like Isaiah Pacheco, the running backs really enjoyed a season of relatively good health, and the wide receivers were dropping like flies, especially in the first half of the season. So that sort of improved the hit rate on running backs last year. I know, like especially the guys you drafted as running back twos, and like those guys were it was hard to miss with the running
like
back
the
twos.
Jacobs, Mixon, Taylor.
Yes. Like a lot of those guys were smash hits, and normally it's not nearly the success rate drafting RB2s, and it kind of lessened the hit rate on some of the wide receiver ones and wide receiver twos. So I think that's going to scare some people away from zero RB or even hero or RB builds, and maybe lure people into robust RB builds. And I hope it does, because as we talked about on that last show, I think zero RB and hero RB are pretty sound strategies still, and maybe even more so this year if people are convinced that they have to load up on running backs in the early rounds. I just think it was this unusual injury distribution that sort of undermined hero RB and zero RB last year.
Yeah, it pushed the strength. I mentioned this as well to the teams. It was very specific player based last year. So we hyped up Bucky Irving on the last show, but let's say you drafted him in the second half of your draft and he was with a Saquon Barkley team, like team's doing well. If he's with a Jamar Gibbs, like if you had certain players, but if you drafted a Christian McCaffery, your team's in a big hole. Like it was quite yes or no in terms of the players that you were drafted and the success that they were able to have. I'm going to spring two questions on you, Pat, that we hadn't discussed on the show sheet, but we did get a quarterback situation now. We have Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston with the New York Giants. They may also go ahead and maybe take something in the draft. We'll see what happens there. Malik Nabers, quarterback proof?
I think based on last year, he's at least quarterback resistant. I don't know about quarterback proof, but and boy, we were really teased with the possibility of getting Jameis Winston and what that might mean for Malik Nabers' numbers, visions of
wild.
it.
Mightn't be good for the Giants, but it would be great for fantasy.
Yes, it would be great for fantasy. Great for defensive backs playing the Giants who would have interceptions flying into their hands. I mean, that's the only issue. If you play Jameis Winston, give him 17 starts, he is probably going to throw somewhere between 30 and 40 interceptions. Yeah. And that's just hard for an NFL team to live that way. So they had to go out and get Russell Wilson, but we know neither of these guys are really long-term answers. So they might just go ahead and get Shedeur Sanders too. Either way, though, I think we have to look at it as a positive, because I think it's likely that Jameis Winston is going to make at least some starts this season, and we are going to be eagerly putting Malik Nabers in our lineups in those weeks, and feel really good about it when we wake up on Sunday mornings, knowing we're getting a Winston to Malik Nabers combination that day.
Yeah, there's no, there's no word, I think, that Wilson is going to get back to anything that we've seen in the past. I was very against him in Pittsburgh last year. I'll be very against the situation here. I think, again, we talked in the last show and I talked about Alvin Kamara and his play over the last couple of years, but Wilson's definitely somebody that's like name-based. Like it's a name-recognized quarterback. It's not a talent-based decision, I think, to have him in there. But the problem is the backup or the person in competition at the moment, obviously Jameis Winston. But Jameis Winston, in my opinion, is a first ballot fantasy football Hall of Famer in terms of like what he has delivered for fantasy. Nothing to do with it, but like, those Chris Godwin's, Mike Evans seasons last year, the Jerry Jeudy breakout. He's like you just let the ball go. That's what you want for fantasy. So we'll see what happens there. The other one I was going to pop in was Christian McCaffery, who I touched on a moment ago, will be 29 entering this season, kind of forgotten about, but now is going as the RB7. Can he relight that fire, or we are at the tail end here for CMC?
I think he can. Obviously just an enormous risk, and it's sort of all about your risk tolerance with CMC. Chance for a big payoff, but there's also a chance that he's going to play fewer than half the games this season, maybe a lot fewer than half. And we also know, based on last season, I mean, now we also have the added insecurity of knowing that Kyle Shanahan is not going to be forthright with us on injury. Yeah. So, I mean, it is a big leap of faith to take him. It is a huge potential payoff, but man, high risk, high reward.
Yeah. It's if you knew that the injuries are not likely to recur, it's a bargain. But the problem is if it recurs at all, it's at least 4 weeks missed at a time. So it's a tricky one. But that is right. At the start of round 2 there in terms of adding him to your roster. But speaking of that, is there a player who was injured or underperformed last season? We mentioned one that was injured, one that underperformed in CJ Stroud. But is there anyone that you think like, oh, this is an overreaction that I like him at his price?
This is more in the underperform category, but and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the Bears and Texans. I think Odunze is a good one. Like rookie numbers weren't terrible, but there's a lot of meat left on the bone. I think I know he was just, I want to say around 54 catches, 750 yards. And as we were talking about before, the Bears had DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, Odunze, and now Keenan Allen is gone. So hopefully Odunze draws more targets, and hopefully Caleb Williams shows improvement as a passer behind a dramatically upgraded offensive line. Bears were really aggressive about fixing their O-line in free agency, and hopefully it pays dividends. Well, I mean, Colm, for us as Packer fans, hopefully not, but I guess for Odunze investors, hopefully that does sort of help the passing game and help Rome have a second-year breakout.
Yeah, he's going as wide receiver 29 at the moment, and an interesting tier of receivers. Another one that I feel like started the season very strong and got injured that is in that tier. I thought he was going to move in free agency, but he is now back with the Buccaneers. Chris Godwin going a few picks ahead of him, then McMillan, and then Metcalf and Cortland Sutton. So you're looking there at the young player trying to take that leap and ascend forward, and it is always interesting when it's a young quarterback and a young wide receiver, and if they can possibly take that leap together, it can be a little bit supercharged as they move forward. I mentioned this last week. It's since you mentioned the Packers connection, I will mention it. Can we get the Jaden Reed bounce back?
Oh, I hope so. His disappearance was a strange thing, Colm, and then it seemed like they sort of flipped the Jaden Reed switch back on for the playoffs.
Yeah,
Matt LaFleur sort of rediscovered him, and he was really the only pass catcher who could make anything happen when he had the ball in his hands. So I'm optimistic about that. Colm, getting back, I'm just curious, since you mentioned how near Godwin was to Odunze as far as ADP, which of those two players would you prefer to have?
I think I would lean on the Odunze side just for like I'm big on like career trajectory and how like things can happen, from year 1 to year 2 and into year 3. Like if you look at Godwin, we're probably like we know what he is and we've probably seen his peak. Now people will say if he stayed healthy last year, he may have had one of those peak seasons, but there's still a lot of competition for Godwin with Evans there. And the other part of that you have to factor in is they have Jalen McMillan there as well, who was having his own breakout down the stretch. So when he comes back in, the kind of arrangement of the chairs could be a little bit different. When they obviously paid him in free agency, but if we look at where we were last year with the Seahawks versus where we are now, they took that step forward and they've decided like we're going with JSN as the guy. Lockett's gone and Metcalf's now gone, and we could be looking at 2 years down the line where Godwin and Evans are both faded out of this offense, and McMillan becomes more of a key piece along with Bucky Irving. So there's a lot of, like, even if you think back to when Godwin went down last year, like the Bucky breakout hadn't happened yet at that point. So there's a lot of things could change. And I would be always, if it's a split decision for me on the veteran versus like a rookie second year or a second year player, I would lean to the tiebreaker there. So the other player that's there is McMillan, Tatora McMillan, and I would lean to him. Like it'd be probably McMillan, then Odunze, then Godwin, then Metcalf, then Sutton in that tier. But the other player that's in that group that's going one pick after Odunze then is Jameson Williams. So I would be taking him up above the veterans as well. The other player that's going to couple the next wide receiver going, if we're going through the ADP, 4 picks after that is Chris Olave. He's going now as the wide receiver 31 after the likes of Metcalf and Cortland Sutton. And like we talked in the last show about Alvin Kamara, but like that was just it felt like a snake bitten or a cursed season for Chris Olave last year between the concussions and then the quarterback injury. Like everything went wrong very quick. He was a second round pick last year that I was very enthusiastic about, his second round ADP. So now that he's going in the mid 6th round, I think that he still has to be quite interesting, but he's in that area of, if you drafted him last year in the 2nd round, he potentially sank your whole season. So it's like going back to him, but you're getting a 4-round discount on him at that point. I think he's an interesting play there in the 6th round. He this week, I mentioned Jaden Reed last week, Chris Olave, my hope to break back into the rankings this season.
I'm with you, Colm. I think he's a terrific player.
It's just never all clicked. It's like,
right,
there's so many highlights of like balls like touching his fingers, or they're like, it's just never connects fully. But I think there's a lot of talent there.
There is, and especially if the Saints don't draft Tet McMillan at number 9, which is a possibility for sure. But otherwise, Olave is poised for a very substantial target share in New Orleans, and I'd love to see him be able to have a season of full health to fully capitalize on the potential, because I do think a healthy Chris Olave has a chance to finish in wide receiver 1 range.
Yeah, there's some like strange things that come up sometimes, when a player's in the league for a long time, you feel like, oh, they're much older, or, we're talking there about Chris Godwin, for example. You're probably like, oh, Chris Olave is, probably closer to Chris Godwin than Rome Odunze, but like there's a 2-year age gap between the two of those guys. Like one's going to be 25 and Chris Olave this June, and the other one is going to be 23 and Odunze. You kind of, you probably think, like people listening, if you're not looking at your computer, you probably feel like Olave is like 28 years old at this point. I think there's still enough room for him to reach that potential that he has.
And I believe Olave played on one of those Ohio State teams with Emeka Egbuka, who's coming into the league this year. So that should reinforce the idea that Chris Olave is not an old wide receiver, although the concerns is that concussions could shorten the career.
Yeah. He had a couple last season and a couple previous, but last season they were pretty close back together. So, but like, with Tua, very concerning when that all occurs. I have an interesting question that I've been sliding into the end of these episodes and looking for people who are newer to the game. I think when you're doing a lot of content, a lot of the time you think of like, well, everyone's listening to all the shows, and like we're here in April and everyone is drafting 50 teams a week. But realistically, like there's people who are still like the game of the NFL. We started the show by talking about there's going to be a game in Ireland this year. Like the growth of the game is huge. So the growth of people then looking for content and becoming fantasy football players as a result is still growing exponentially at this point. So there will be people that are playing fantasy for the first time this year. And we get a lot of questions even from like listeners about dynasty topics, about their first or second year starting to play dynasty after playing redraft, for a certain period of time. But the question I have is like looking at it more from a perspective of a newcomer or somebody who's, recent to fantasy. Is there anything that you wish you knew sooner about playing fantasy that has made you a better player? And I do preference this by saying the landscape changed more in the last 5 years, I think, than it probably did in the last 30 prior to that. So probably more in the recent, because I know, Pat, you've been playing fantasy for many years.
Yeah, since the Kenny Stabler days. No, not quite that long, but a long time. Yeah, and really, there were few developed strategies back in the days when I started playing. Like it was just sort of, everyone wanted running backs with their first 2 picks, and it was definitely the stone ages of fantasy football strategy.
Obviously, though, purely basically touchdown dependent, so running backs did hold a massive advantage at that point.
Very,
Yeah.
very touchdown dependent. So for newer people, Colm, or maybe people who don't obsess about fantasy football to anything close to the degree that you and I do, yeah, I've got something that I've sort of figured out over the years. I think whether you're a fantasy football newbie playing against, you know, people who've been in leagues for a while, or a shark swimming with the fish, you should be scaling your risk tolerance based on the level of competition. And so we were just talking about Christian McCaffery, for instance. And I think if you're one of the sharpest managers in your league and someone who does eat, sleep, and breathe fantasy football, you probably should not be drafting Christian McCaffery, because you're going to be outdrafting the competition
Elsewhere.
throughout the draft.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially in the middle and later rounds, when it helps to have this broad-based knowledge of the league. So why place a risky early first-round bet, or I should say early round bet, on an older player with a worrisome injury history? You should be making a safer bet and then crushing the competition later in the draft. But conversely, if you're a smaller fish swimming with sharks, you need to embrace risk, because big payoffs are your best chance to win and beat the people who just know more about fantasy than you do. So drafting Christian McCaffery makes perfect sense for a novice player, because if McCaffrey somehow manages to play 17 games, he's going to give you a big advantage. So basically, boiled down, strength loves certainty and weakness loves risk. So do an honest self-assessment and calibrate your approach accordingly.
And as we get ready to close out, I know you're doing a lot of work looking through the rookies, the profiles, as you get ready for the draft as well over at Fantasy Pros. The rookie class, I always think that's something that you mentioned, the risk tolerance. I think drafting rookies in the past has probably become more commonplace in people's strategies now, but something that we've always talked about at RotoViz is the first and second year players are the players likely to make the biggest leap in terms of where their value is now to where their value will be the following season. Again, Bucky Irving been another example of that over the past 12 months. But is that, I think I know your answer, I'm just setting you up here to talk about it, but is that something that you try to lean into or avoid? I do think it comes down to like the risk. Like people, it's the same with anything in life. People want to see the result before they buy. Like you want to, like, it's easier to buy a house if you can walk through the building versus like look at plans and then make your decision. It's easier if you can like book a holiday when you've been to that place before. There's a lot of things people are waiting to see what the player does before they buy them in fantasy as well. So the rookies, you haven't been able to see what they can do in the NFL, but the time to buy them is before they do it. Lean
Yes,
into it or avoid.
lean in. And you said it, Colm, like some fantasy managers need to see it before they believe it.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like quarterback prospects where we sometimes worry about the QB prospects who have to see the open receiver before they release the ball. We want anticipatory throwers.
Yeah.
So you want to be an anticipatory drafter. Like rookies are usually discounted because they have no NFL track record, and rookies are often some of the best values in the draft.
Yeah, I think consistently rookies, like there'll be obviously ones that fail, but when they hit the out deliver on the players, the veteran players that'll be going in similar ranges if they were to deliver. Pat, that's going to get us to the end of the second show that we have recorded this week. If you haven't had a chance to go back and listen to the first one, I would recommend doing it. We talked a lot, as I mentioned at the start, about the running back position for 2025, the overall landscape. The draft is on the way. You mentioned to me before the show, we're not talking golf here, but you mentioned the Masters coming up and some of the coverage that you're getting ready to do for that. Anything you want to highlight draft related or Masters related to the listeners here?
Yeah, if anyone is thinking about betting the Masters, I do co-host the Betting Pros PGA podcast, and we'll be doing a big Masters preview, and I think it would be the 7th of April, probably release the 8th of April. So check that out. And just go to fantasypros.com. We've got all sorts of NFL draft coverage, dynasty coverage. We're even thinking redraft this time of year, Colm. And, check out the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast and the Fantasy Pros Dynasty Podcast.
Awesome. It's been absolute pleasure to have Pat on. When I was getting back in the saddle to do some of these kind of solo related shows, Pat was one of the first people I reached out to, one of my best friends in the entire business, and love to have those conversations. We have a connection over the Packers, but it's really grown over the years. But Pat, thank you for jumping on the podcast. We'll hopefully do it again in the not too distant future. But that is where we're going to close out this edition of the RotoViz Fantasy Football Podcast. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave us a rating and review. And until we are back, have a good one.